James Powers, thanks so much for coming on and talking about your book, Saving the Farm. Now, when you say farm, to me, that is near and dear to my heart because my grandfather was a dairy farmer in Indiana. And when you talk about history, and you are a high school history professor, this is right up my alley too. So let's start from the beginning about the Dudley Farm in North Guilford and how you helped save that farm that goes back hundreds of years. So give me, what happened?
Well, first of all, it really was a community effort, and if it wasn't for the North Guilford Volunteer Fire Company having the vision to save this farm to begin with, it never would have happened.
And we should say that the last descendant gave this farm to a church and to a volunteer fire department, which puts everybody in a quagmire.
Exactly, because you know, it was completely unexpected. David didn't belong to either. And so it was sort of a surprise to the entire community. And
this is David Dudley.
David Dudley, right, the last owner. He had no direct descendants. And when he did do that, Ann, he set in motion a number of different things. First of all, ideally, what to do with the farm. But second of all, how would the farm be saved, and how would the community be able to do it? And
tell me about this farm. 10 acres only? How
well,
big
it's
was the
down
farm?
to 10 acres now, and that's one of the sad stories of the farm, is that David's father, Nathan, died in 1963.
And it dates all the way back
to... Well, actually, the property was in the Dudley family going back to the early 18th century, around 1720, 1722, something like that. But David's father had been a pillar of the community. He had been the justice of the peace, and he did everything he could to hang on to that farm. It was 100 acres he had inherited from his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, 110 acres, excuse me. And the sad thing was, after the Great Depression, with the decline of farming in Connecticut, he had to sell the farm off in chunks. And so by the time he died, it was down to 10 acres. And I can't help but imagine it must have broke his heart to see that happen.
When did you start romancing about the Dudley Farm?
Well, actually, it was on my way to an interview to teach high school in Guilford back in 1983, to teach history. And I drove by the farm that very first day, and I did a double take, because it really, even today, if you drive by it, it's a vision from the 19th century. It just, the way the house sits on the hill, the way the barns are framed by the trees and the fields and the woods behind, it evokes another time, and I was mystified from the beginning.
So he gives this farm to the church, to the fire department. Enter in James Powers and a whole host of characters. And you start doing what to save this farm?
Well, the fire company agreed with the North Guilford Congregational Church to let them take David Dudley's savings. They felt that the property would be something that would be more that they could handle, and that meant that the fire company then had to decide what they were going to do with it. There were the idea that maybe they could sell the property. It was a developer's dream. It's on the corner of 77 and 80, the state highway. So, they had a lot of discussions about exactly what to do, and eventually a number of them came forward and said, we really need to save this farm. And the reason, and that's one of the major ideas behind the whole idea of the Dudley Farm itself. They needed to save it for the present and future generations, because they really were lamenting the changes that had taken place, not just in Guilford, but now North Guilford, through development, and the farms are all disappearing. And even before David died, I learned later, his farm was sort of like an icon of the past.
How
and
so?
People, well, because it represented an agricultural past that was disappearing forever. And so people in North Guilford really began to identify with that farm as a symbol of their heritage. And when David did give the farm to the North Guilford Volunteer Fire Company, that's really where they went with it. They said, we don't know what to do or how to do it, but we want to save this farm as a symbol of our agricultural past. And I was lucky enough to get involved because very early on, they were courageous enough to start to look for help. They realized we don't know what to do with this. And I was running an archaeology program at Guilford High School, and also I teach history through architecture. So I was contacted along with my good friend Tom Letty, who was the woodshop teacher at the time, to see if we could bring high school students over to help with the restoration.
Which is the magic, I think.
Oh, it was the most wonderful educational experience I ever had.
So the principal says, or superintendent says,
well,
get those kids in there.
And that was a brave move on their part because, you know, if you know local communities in terms of their budgets and things like that, that meant taking me and Tom and the kids out of the school for 2 class periods, which in the early 1990s was just not done.
So what did you do over a period of time with these kids?
Well, what we were able to do is not only help with the restoration of the farm, but because by then we had decided it was, as a group with the Dudley Farm Committee, it became, and then the Dudley Foundation, that we wanted to restore the farm to circa 1900, which was the most appropriate time based on what was there. So the kids were helping us not only with the restoration of the farm, but they were also studying daily life in the 19th century. So they did everything from carding wool to helping with the animals, to figuring out planting, you know, the cycles of the seasons,
did
telling
you
the
get
weather.
pushback from the kids, or did they kind of start to get
And
into
it was magical. We had kids who were going to Ivy League schools mixed with kids whose shop was the only way they were going to get out of high school. And these kids gelled in ways that were just amazing. I'll never forget one day we had this lovely young lady from a very wealthy family on her way to Purdue. On the top 10,
my alma mater.
Oh, there you go. Top 10 of her graduating class, gorgeous clothes, and she was working side by side with this kid dressed all in black. And then back in the early 90s, they still did the chains. I don't know if you remember that phase with pulled back hair, surly as anything. And those two were in the house singing together, just singing as they were scraping old wallpaper and patching plaster. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment. And that was what it was like for these kids. So,
what do we learn from the past, and what do these students learn from the past at the Dudley Farm?
One of the things that we insisted on, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was that as communities, we're losing our connection with the past, and kids more than anybody. I always joke around with them that they're sort of like rootless plants or orphans. They don't have a sense of connection to where they live, because they've lost that sense of history, or the sense of place, as I like to call it. And by doing this type of program, and even by saving the farm, and by having people go visit the farm now, you know, they reconnect with that past. You know, so they have a sense of who they are, because otherwise, I always joke around with them and say they might as well live in California. You know, when you look around,
where everything's new,
right? Or it's just sprawl with identical stores. You know, and the same old strip malls and the same houses. You know, they may be a little different in a community like Guilford, but they're still sort of Jack houses in a way.
In this book, which I found was fascinating, that you go back through the generations of the Dudleys, and you talk about all the different things that they went through, and then you talk about modern times, and you talk about a sense of place and who we are. I'm wearing a pair of earrings that are arguably 150 years old.
Yeah, that's awesome.
From my French great-grandmother, who, of course, I never met.
Right.
But I'd like to think it connects me to her.
It does.
And so when you look at the generations of this farm, and it's so beautifully written, and prose is in here as well.
Right. Oh, thank you.
It connects you. And I think that Connecticut is doing a good job with their historic barn trail now.
Right.
We have about 10,000 barns in all different shapes and sizes, tiny to large, that are still existing in various different phases.
Yep.
And I think New England is so rich in our history that you're right, if we don't preserve it, How do we learn?
It's
How do we
gonna
go
go on.
forward if we don't know what happened in the
Yeah,
past?
and I tell my students or anybody else who listens, once things are gone, they're gone. You're never getting them back, you know. And that was one of the beautiful things about one of the things I detail in the book is how we were able to save the Munger barn from over in Madison, and eventually we were able to put it up at the Dudley Farm, and it is now on the barn. The historic
It's on the barn
trail,
trail,
as well
right.
as the main barn on the property, and what that meant to the community at the time, because that barn raising was we were determined to have an old-fashioned by hand barn raising. You know, we all joked around that we had all grown up at some point or had seen the movie Witness with Harrison
Sure.
Ford with the Amish, and we wanted to have that experience. And when we planned it out, we never expected it to be quite what it was. You know, when at one point we had 30 or 40 people helping to lift the frame, and you looked out on the hills around, you know, up above where the barn was going up, and there had to be 1,000, 2,000 people, and some were crying, some were cheering. It was just it was really, for I think everyone involved, a spiritual thing, and really caused that connection with the past. You know, just like your earrings, you know, we were touching beams of that barn that were made by craftsmen in the mid 1800s, you know, and it was wonderful to save something that they had put together.
This is your first book, Saving the
Yep.
Farm. You kind of
Yep.
said goodbye, I suppose, to all the things that you did at the Dudley Farm
Right.
with this book.
Right.
What got you into history in the first place? Does it go back to when you built with Lincoln Logs as a kid, or
Well,
where does this
actually,
come
it
from?
was probably my dad. My dad never went to college. He was a lithographer, but he loved history, and he would, any chance he had, he'd drag us off to a battlefield or a historic site or a historic home. And I just grew up with a love of history. That's what got me through high school. I wasn't the best student, but I was an ace when it came to history. Got me into college, and I continued there. And afterwards, when I graduated, I wanted to share that love of history with students, and that's why I got into teaching. And so for me, writing this book is a culmination of a lot of that, not just my involvement with the farm, but that, you know, that whole idea that, you know, I do have something that I want to say to the general public about the past and how important it is.
And what else are you going to say? Now that you have one book under your belt, what else is coming?
Well, I have a couple planned. One I started working on now, where I'm going to follow the life struggles of Milo Todd. He was a millwright and a miller from Northford, Connecticut in the mid 1800s, and the whole idea about following Milo's life is that wherever he went, things never seemed to work for him, but the person who came afterwards made it big. And so there are a lot of lessons in that about how our struggles sometimes may not work out, but the history of what happened is just as important. And so whether or not it was an old mill in Northford that he finally gave up, and eventually it became the person who owned it, Stevens, became one of the founders of International Silver Company, for example, or even the fact that Thelis Todd, Milo's grandfather, was in the American militia during the Revolution, and he was stationed at Fort Griswold in Groton. And 2 days before Benedict Arnold and the British attacked Fort Griswold and massacred the entire garrison, Thelis Todd came down with a terrible case of dysentery and was sent home. And the day he got home was the day of the attack. And the whole idea that a lot of times history's accident, you know,
Absolutely.
and what we see around us is sometimes a product of a lot of different things.
So you are recreating what was.
Yeah, well, I'm trying.
What's your legacy going to be when people say, oh, you know, that history stuff, I never was into that.
Yeah.
You're giving a gift to many people if they just pay attention. So what's the legacy, James?
Well, I like to think that I do this with my students at, in the high school. I want people to understand that those who lived in the past were just like us. They got up in the morning, they ate their meals, they went to work, they had their joys, they had their sorrows, they had their struggles, you know, but they tried to do the best they can, and that's really what history's all about. It's not just about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, but it's about those day-to-day people. And that was one of the things when I was writing Saving the Farm I was determined to do. I wanted to make somebody from each generation come alive.
And you did.
So, oh, thank you. That was sort of the plan, and so and I think by understanding that human connection, just like your great-grandmother,
Earrings.
Yeah, earrings, right? That human connection is so important. You know, one of my favorite things I like to do with students is I like to hand them a 4,000 or 5,000 year old Native American point. And I always say to them, you know, when I found this, when I was doing archaeology, I was the first person to touch this in over 4,000 years, and now you are doing the same. And you should see the light bulbs go off. You know, immediately there's a connection there that they have with the past, and that's sort of what I'm hoping to do.
Well, James Powers, thank you so much for bringing history alive, and thanks for writing
happy to
Saving
be
the
here.
Farm. And we'll look for the next book.
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.